got it. Great. I want to get his bio up real quick. Okay. Great. Now I've got it. Thank you. So this room is for our student-centered AAC for learners with cortical and vision impairments. For those of you who attended our earlier session, this is somewhat of a continuation of services there in respect to cortical vision impairment. Let me just give everybody another minute. I see some more people coming in. Hold on. Welcome, welcome. Okay, so if you're coming into Aurora 1, you're coming into the cortical vision impairment. Chris Russell is the project coordinator for the New York Deaf and Blind Collaborative and is very experienced as a classroom teacher and teacher of the visually impaired, TVI. So we're excited to have him here again to talk about child-centered learning. Thank you, Chris.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks. All right, I haven't done anything yet. Okay, I'm sure we'll have more people trickling in, so just kind of keep it going. Again, how many people who are in here now were here in my first session earlier? Okay, so the majority of people. So it will definitely be sort of a continuation to some extent. If you weren't here earlier, hopefully you have at least some background in overview of cortical visual impairment. We'll do a little quick kind of recap on some of that before we move into more technical stuff related to AAC, alternative augmentative communication. Again, this is specifically based on the approaches of Dr. Roman Lancy, which deal with functional educational approaches and functional learning approaches to creating intervention that's based on assessment in 10 characteristics that are unique to CVI. We got through, I think, 6 of them. We got through complexity in the last session, which I think is the most critical one. But we'll do a recap on that and sort of touch base on those last 4 that I didn't get to. Once again, really driving home this point that it's important to identify and assess CVI because we should actually expect to see improvement in visual functioning in kids with CVI with the right intervention, with the right support. It has to be based on assessment because it's a really different approach depending on what phase on the range of CVI your child is in. So here you have 0 to 3 is phase 1. That's the most severe impact on visual functioning. 3 to 7 is phase 2. That's sort of moderate. And then phase 3 is 7 to 10. That's close to or nearing typical visual functioning. And we'll really look at intervention approaches that are unique to each of those phases in order to understand how that applies to communication systems. Communication systems, just like instructional materials or toys or anything else, need to be adapted based on what phase the child's in. Okay, so we went through these characteristics before, so I'll real quickly skim through these. Remember, we talked about color being an impact, movement being an impact, visual latency, look at that fancy animation, visual fields with specific visual field preferences that are unique to CVI, lower visual field being a real challenge for the most part, ongoing throughout the phases. Complexity is the really big one, and we looked at different types of complexity. Complexity of the array, complexity of the target, right? Complexity of the array being on the bottom right, bottom middle, and bottom right, and complexity of the target on the bottom left. Right, we talked sort of briefly about light. It's not just about light gazing, but it's also about functional ways of using light. So as a child moves along the range and improves their visual functioning on the CVI range, now when light used to be a distractor and the child was just staring at bright primary sources of light, as they progress in their visual functioning, its light enhances attending. So usually backlit surfaces, iPads, A really key one is if you have a student who's in a classroom that uses a smartboard. Smartboards are projector lit. They're not backlit. So smartboards are actually harder to see than a TV screen or an iPad. So usually my go-to recommendation for a student who is in a classroom, let's say an elementary classroom with a smartboard, being lit by a projector, it's more hazy, it's not as bright and backlit, is I'll recommend that that child with CVI have an iPad that's hooked up to the smartboard via Bluetooth or wireless. They're seeing exactly what's on the smartboard, but they have it right in front of them on a backlit surface. Okay, so bigger is not better. It's more lighting, movement, color, and adaptations. Okay, so we didn't get to this one, so it's a good chance to get to it. Distance viewing is the next characteristic. Kids with CVI tend to have difficulty with viewing things at a distance, and we can think about distance in terms of at near, which is like up to 18 inches, then maybe 2 to 3 feet, 3 to 4 feet, 4 to 6 feet, 6 to 8 feet, 8 to 10 feet, and then 10 feet and beyond, or even 20 feet and beyond. And what you'll notice is that distance is really the exact same thing as complexity. There's really no difference between distance and complexity of the array. And the reason for that is if you're very, very close to something, there's not as much array. So from where I'm standing, it's a very busy array. So many people in this room, so much activity, but if I came right up to you, I reduce the array. I'm looking only at you, I'm 2 feet away from you, and you're all that I see. All the rest of the information kind of gets drowned out. So the further away you move from something, the more busy the array is. The example of this busy preschool classroom shelf with, 100 different sensory toys, there's so much going on there. But if the child is 1 foot away from that, they're not looking at as much. They're only looking at maybe 1 or 2 toys on the shelf. They back up and the array gets busier. So it's important to know how much distance can your child deal with. And you can use other things, other characteristics to address distance. So using color or movement to address distance. You can improve a child's ability to use their vision at a further distance by using bright, shiny, colorful things that they may not need to look at near. You have a child who's moved way beyond the point of only being able to look at a bright, red, shiny pom-pom. Well, that bright, red, shiny pom-pom that they used to need when they were a little lower on the range, now you can use it to get their attention 10 feet away. So when you walk into a room, you're waving that. Hey, I'm over here, without saying it. Right? And you're drawing the child's vision out to be used at a distance by using color, movement, light, all those characteristics. Okay, visual reflexes. Yeah, visual reflexes we didn't get to. Very simple 2 visual reflexes. There is blink to touch. So a light touch on the bridge of the nose between the eyebrows. You guys are pretty good. Usually there's like somebody who's trying it on themselves in the audience. It doesn't work on yourself. A blink to touch is actually a reflex that should develop prenatally at 8 weeks gestation. You should be born with that reflex. It's a prenatal reflex. Kids with CVI often do not have that reflex, or it's delayed. So the touch and then, 2-3 second pause and then a blink, or it's inconsistent. They blink sometimes and they don't blink other times. So that's the first one, blink to touch. The second blink reflex is blink to threat. So you can practice that with just doing kind of like a hand movement toward your face. Try different sides, try central, try right, try upper, down, try right and left eyes. Again, it doesn't work on yourself if you know it's coming. But it's good to know if your child is blinking to threat, or if they're blinking with a delay, or they're blinking inconsistently. So it's those 2 reflexes that you're looking at. This characteristic of all the 10, it's the only one that obviously there is no intervention for that. I'll say it again, I'm not recommending that you poke kids in the face for therapy. Okay? So it's really just a gauge for figuring out where is the child in their visual development. And you'll see that progress over time as those reflexes resolve. So blink to touch should resolve before threat. The next one is visual novelty. We talked a lot about this before, so I won't spend too much time, but basically This overlaps with all the characteristics because kids with CVI have an easier time looking at things that are familiar to them, a harder time looking at things that are brand new to them, including environments, objects, and people. The last characteristic is visually guided reach. So typical visually guided reach is I look at an object and I reach toward it at the same time. So I see what I want to reach toward and I continue to look at it as I reach toward it. Kids with CVI tend to do a couple possible different things. They'll look and then they'll look away and reach. So I see where it is, I'm looking away to reach at it. Or they'll look and reach, and as soon as they're touching it, they'll look away. Or they'll feel around for things, and once they've found something tactily, now I can look at it. All three are abnormal uses of visually guided reach. You'll see that resolve over time, and usually it's the things that are more complicated or in more complex environments or even in positioning that isn't as comfortable where the child will have more trouble with the visually guided reach. And again, it's not a problem, it's just a way of kind of gauging where is the child. You're not telling them you must look and reach at the same time. Never hold a kid's head in order to try to get them to look at something. Never hand over hand take their hand and try to force them to reach towards something while looking. They're doing what they need to be doing based on where their visual functioning is, and it will improve by giving them more opportunity to reach toward things that are easier for them to see. Okay, so that's the brief one. So straight to the core of the conversation, to AAC. This came about, this sort of presentation, I guess, and this kind of work I've been doing around this, it came about because of an actual need that I observed functionally in all the schools that I was going to and the many, many kids with CVI that I've been working with, where I was seeing this really significant mismatch between communication systems and visual access. What I mean by that is either communication that is visually inaccessible, so the kid has a communication system, it's totally inappropriate based on where the child's visual development is, where they fall in the CVI range. Communication system hypothetically is good conceptually or cognitively, but it's not visually accessible. Or the opposite, it's visually accessible, but it is inappropriate in terms of communication development. So the child's able to see the communication system, but it doesn't match their current expressive communication level. So for example, kids in phase 1 who are using an eye gaze system, it's just not appropriate. In phase 1, there's no way that you could actually effectively use an eye gaze system because in phase 1 of CVI, you're not making eye-to-object contact. You're not looking directly at things. You're only kind of regarding or orienting towards objects. So it's not possible to succeed with an eye gaze system in phase 1. Someone got an email. Phase 3 example, I've seen this actually very often, where the student has a really complex, beautifully looking two-dimensional iPad communication system, like a Proloquo to go or a Dynavox or one of these systems that has all the little icons, and it's adapted perfectly for their CVI with highlights and colors and blocking out areas, and it looks great, but the child is pre-symbolic. The child is not using symbolic communication expressively yet, and so it's way over the child's head in terms of current mode of expressive communication. Okay? So that's also a mismatch. Another email. So population statistics again. Proportion of cases of kids with CDKL5 disorders with reported cortical visual impairment. Again, I think that the reported proportion, which is like around 1/5 or 1/4 maybe, around 1/5, is probably lower than the actual occurrence or actual prevalence, because those are kids who are hypothetically diagnosed with CVI. But then over here, expressive communication in those aged at least 2 years. This is interesting. You have about 1/3 of kids with CDKL5 disorders, at least age 2, have what they called simple communication, which I think I'm interpreting to mean gestures, behaviors, basically pre-symbolic but intentional forms of communication. So ability to act or express on objects and people, but it doesn't look like conventional symbolic communication. Okay? And then you have about half may be beyond the level of just behavioral communication, have some complex gestures. That could be like waving high, like a conventional gesture, waving high, pointing, anything that's socially understood. And even some use of concrete symbols, which we'll talk really specifically about. That's like tangible symbols or some sort of an object symbol system, and vocalizations. And they may even be specific vocalizations for a pretty good proportion. And then you have another, maybe 1/5, who have spoken language, signs, and abstract symbols. So we have the whole gamut here, and that's exactly what we're going to talk about, is across the CVI phases, adapting for the whole gamut of communication needs. Okay, because AAC includes all of these things. So this is my big sort of thing. This is my big sort of way of looking at this, is to have a balanced communication plan. Okay? The balance is between sensory access, so that whatever the communication system or systems are, that they are sensory appropriate, sensory accessible, meaning that they match the child's CVI phase, where is this child currently in their visual functioning, and the specific impactive characteristics of CVI characteristics, and that they also match the child's preferences, their preferred learning channels. Are they auditory? Are they visual? Are they tactile? Are they a combination of those? Are they kinesthetic? So sensory access is balanced with communication level access. And by communication level access, I mean expressive communication. I don't mean receptive. So expressive communication. Currently, how is your child expressing themselves? Is it pre-symbolic or symbolic? And we'll talk a little bit about that too. Is it pre-linguistic or linguistic? And then just, to sort of quell any criticism, on the sensory side, I'm still talking about multisensory access and universal design, right? So we should still make things and use systems that are appropriate to everyone, but they have to match your child's level. And then this is what makes speech pathologists really happy, if there's any of you guys in the room. I'm still talking about modeling total communication. Okay? I'm still talking about receptively providing a robust AAC program, which means, of course, we're still talking to kids. If it's appropriate, we're signing to kids. We're still using high forms of communication, abstract forms of communication, but we're also modeling expressive forms that are appropriate to where your child is now. Because otherwise, how do they get to the next level? Okay? So the whole CVI range stuff is sort of balanced by looking at expressive communication levels. So this is a poster that we made at the New York Deaf Blind Collaborative. It's almost that big. No, it's like the size of a door, actually, I think. And if you guys want a copy of this poster, just email me and I'll send you a copy of it. It's pretty good. We basically made it in order to make communication assessment and understanding communication development a little bit less terminology heavy. So it basically has, from top to bottom, on the left, you're seeing levels of development of expressive communication, which start with just reflexes. Right? The child doesn't even know that they're communicating, it's just reflexive. Going down into purposeful actions, intentional behaviors, to unconventional communication, which is not yet symbolic, but it's like unconventionally communicating, hard to interpret, and then down to conventional communication, waving high. This is not yet language. Waving high, nodding head for your shaking head for yes or no. Those are not yet symbolism, but they're generally conventionally understood ways of communicating. Then down into abstract symbols like first words and then combined symbols, combinations of two or more words, all the way down to formal language structures. So basically what we've done here is we have the levels of communication and then examples of what that communication might look like. And the examples, they're hard to read from here, but they're actually specific examples of behaviors that you might observe. So think like, where does that fit? And then strategies to use with a child who's on that level expressively, and then a little notes section for your own student or child. So the key here is, where is your child expressively? What are the mastered levels, like the levels that the child's using all the time? What are the emerging levels that they're maybe only using in certain environments or with certain people or in really specific contexts, or maybe they're just happening but not consistently? And then are these behaviors, are these communicative behaviors happening across routines? Are they happening across communication partners? And are they happening across functions of communication? And by functions of communication, we're looking at 4 primary functions of communication. And I think you can kind of fit any communication into these 4 functions. It's really important to think about this and to have any communication plan be based on thinking about all of these functions, because it's very common in an educational environment to focus specifically on obtain, right? Request, 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 request. I want this, I want that, and there's not a lot of other opportunities to communicate. So the 4 functions of communication: refusing something or rejecting something that you don't want, obtaining or requesting something that you do want, social interaction, and then seeking or providing information. So it's important to think not just about intervention in one function, but across functions. Sort of a little quick 101 on symbolism. When we talk about symbolism, this is what we're talking about. Symbolism is the understanding that a symbol refers to an event, activity, object, or person. So you have 2 components in symbolism. You have the symbol and the referent. The symbol refers to something, and symbolism allows us, if we have symbolic communication, it allows us to communicate about things that are beyond our arm's reach. So I can actually use the cap of the water bottle to communicate about the water bottle that's nowhere near. The water bottle is out of my sight, out of my view, but I'm showing you the cap in order to communicate about that thing that's over here. So in this case, the cap is the symbol and the water bottle is the referent, the thing that the symbol refers to. Any communication system symbolically has to have thoughtfulness put into thinking about what's called the iconicity of the symbolism. The iconicity is how concrete to how abstract is this symbol. This symbol here, this cap for the water bottle, is pretty concrete. Right? It's pretty easy to understand what I'm referring to in context. Whereas if it was just a blue circle on a card, it would be very hard for me to figure out what it was or to communicate to you what is it that I'm communicating about. So you have an icon is the actual a piece of the object itself. An index is a little bit more abstract. It could be like a picture of it. And the symbol is something that's really abstract. That's like the word water bottle, or maybe like a line drawing of a water bottle. So we need to be really thoughtful about what's appropriate in terms of the iconicity, the abstraction, or the concreteness of any particular symbol system that we're using. Okay, so for modes of communication, I'm just going to skim through this so we don't spend too much time on it, but pre-symbolic modes versus symbolic modes. Okay, plenty of different pre-symbolic modes of communication to focus on modeling, if that's where your child is at. And then symbolic modes are more like spoken language, speech, forms of AAC if they're pretty abstract, sign language, literacy modes, print and braille, etc. Right? What's really important here is that in between these two, there's a bridge. There has to be something to connect pre-symbolic to symbolic. So for a child who is primarily communicating on a pre-symbolic level, very commonly we talk about using object cues or tangible symbols. So this is a concrete communication system. The purpose of this communication system is to bridge the gap between pre-symbolic communication and beginning emerging language. Kids who are typically developing in terms of communication often make that jump without additional intervention, whereas kids who have any kind of communication delays, especially if there's any level of visual impairment attached to it, very commonly benefit from this scaffold or this kind of ladder to symbolic communication. So what is that? Tangible symbols are tactile, manipulative representations of activities, objects, places, events, concepts, or people, which can be used for expressive and receptive communication. They're bridged to symbolism. They can be whole objects, they can be parts of objects, they can be associated objects or textures or shapes. On a really abstract level, they can be line drawings, they can be photographs. But again, think about iconicity. Think about what CVI characteristics are implicit here. So what's that balance between sensory access and communication level access? And in this case, sensory access is all about, well, look at that bright orange ball, which represents gym, right? It's pretty good in terms of CVI. It's totally appropriate for a child who is at CVI, around early phase 2, even at the earliest. But cognitively, does that have a concrete relationship to the activity that the student does in gym? When the student sees that bright orange ball, does it connect? Does it relate to something that they actually experience in the gym activity? Or do we need something more concrete, like something that's actually used in the gym activity? Right? And so you can sort of look at all of these and see, well, the fork is probably pretty closely related. It's pretty concrete. Right? We may need a little bit of additional visual adaptation. So we'll look as we go along at how we might think about adapting these kinds of systems. This is the one where I often see the highest level of mismatch is use of photos and line drawings. Which do you think would be more abstract, photos or line drawings? Line drawings, right? Check these out, right? Photos are pretty closely, they're miniatures, but they're representations of an actual thing. So here, this is a student with CVI who really loved this trampoline. This was a student in the classroom I actually taught in. And this was the first symbol that she learned because she loved that trampoline. And so it's an actual picture of that real trampoline, just like against a bright colored background. Down on the bottom right, you have line drawings. These are kind of like the typically used Mayor Johnson symbols that are very often sort of used in ABA programs or programs for kids with autism. I think that I've almost never seen an appropriate use of these for kids with CVI because look at how complex those things are. They're really abstract. They're conceptually abstract. Like, what is that? What's that one on the left? That's the symbol for shadow, right? How much intense abstract cognitive thinking and conceptual understanding and different points of reference do you have to have in order to look at a little cartoon of a wooden post with the sun shining on it and a little black line coming out from it and an arrow pointing at the black line, to look at that and say, oh, that's shadow. Right? It's pretty complicated. And it's also visually very complicated too. Right? Line drawings are very abstract. Who should use photos and line drawings? Well, it depends on the CVI phase. What I didn't really get to talk to in the last one, which we'll talk specifically about in terms of CVI phases and goals across phases, is that until around the middle of phase 2, there's just no processing of two-dimensional information. Right? 2D recognition and 2D processing photos, processing drawings, processing pictures in a picture book. It's really not happening until around the middle of phase 2. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't expose kids to books. Of course you should. Doesn't mean that you shouldn't expose kids to photos. But don't expect that they're going to be processing them until they get a little bit higher up. Right? So photos and line drawings, neither one of those would be appropriate for anyone in phase 1 or in early phase 2. So consider the CVI phase, and then also consider the level of abstract understanding of what this thing refers to. So that's where that balance of sensory access and communication access really hits home in this example. Communication level access, expressive level of understanding, much, much, much easier with a photo of a real object that the child is really used to seeing than a really abstract, conceptually strange line drawing of that same thing. In terms of level of communication development for actually using tangible symbols, if a child does not yet have symbolism, the understanding that a symbol refers to an object, they need to just practice on learning that skill. So this is another one where I see a real mismatch in the use of tangible symbols. You might have a system that looks totally appropriate, and hypothetically it could be used well, but ends up getting used in a way that's way over the student's head. So if the child does not yet have symbolism, you just want to use the tangible symbol. So in my example, I'm using a cap, probably against a background, glue it onto a cardboard background, just to separate it out and show this is a symbol. This is not the actual cap that we're going to use. This is a symbol that we use to describe or refer to the water bottle. So if the student doesn't yet know, this means that you're just using it to learn it. And there's pretty straightforward steps for doing that. You want to be just learning the symbol, just learning the use of the symbol before you move on to using the symbol in a complex communication system, like for literacy purposes or for a schedule, setting up and talking about an entire day. And the reason for that is pretty clear. It's that if you have 20 different symbols and you don't know what any of them mean yet, it's a totally useless and meaningless experience to talk about planning the whole day. First we're going to go to gym, then we're going to have snack, then we're going to take a nap, then we're going to have reading time. The student doesn't yet know what any of those symbols mean, so it's really just confusing. First we need to focus on just learning what they mean. So the way to do that, pretty clear, I think 6 steps. Show the symbol, pair it with language, right? Time for water. Do you want water? We're going to get some water. Sign language or speech or a combination of the two, whatever's appropriate for the child. Within 30 seconds, go to the activity or pair it with the referent. Because you wait too long and suddenly the symbol that you showed and the thing that you referred to, they're too far apart in space and time and they lose their connection and their meaning. So immediately go to the activity, carry the symbol with you to the activity, right? The reason for that is that practice makes perfect. They say that in typical language development, you have to hear or experience a word 1,000 times before you learn it, before you really absorb what does this word mean. So the only way we're going to learn this word, this symbol, is again, 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 again. Look, we're still having water. Look, do you want more water? So that's why, especially with things like this, with activities that are sort of repeated activities, functional, like taking a drink or taking a bite of food, or like play activities, you want to kind of break them apart and take little breaks. Every 2 minutes, take a little break. Reintroduce the symbol. Do you want more water? Look, do you want to keep playing this game? And that's just for more experience with it. And then very importantly, extremely importantly, at the end of the activity, place the symbol in a box that means finished. A finish box can be any kind of container that's always used to mean finish. Whenever things are finished, they go into that box. And then repeat. What's that? A start box? Probably not necessarily a start box as much as just a place where the symbols usually come from so that they don't just appear out of nowhere. So a start box could just be a communication board even, or a place where the symbols are stored. Good question.
We're starting something new. The girl that I met has cerebral palsy, and we're doing a schedule for her. And when she first comes in, we want to take her to her locker, and we started making the little pieces to go with it. Like what you're
Oh, I think they want to give you the microphone. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay. So we're in the process of making her schedule. So when she gets off the bus, we go to her locker, and she doesn't know that we are wanting to do this schedule yet. So what would you recommend at first instead of overwhelming her? So she gets off the bus, we'll go to her locker, hang things up, and then go to her classroom. Should we make something for every single step? Because she's going to have like 8 or 10 different things throughout the whole day. How do you introduce those things to her but not overwhelm her?
That's a good question. Does she have an understanding of what any of them mean yet, or are you still building that knowledge, that
I think
connection?
she does with some things,
Some?
like her gait trainer or like recess, in her medicine, her tubing.
That's great. So she's at this really wonderful transitional period where she's got some symbols down and then there's new ones that she needs to learn. So the new ones that she needs to learn, you want to do that with. The ones that she already knows, you can start to use them for conversations. So at times where she's not doing that activity, you can talk about planning them. But for the schedule, I would take off the ones that she doesn't know. Because the ones that she doesn't know, putting them in the schedule is definitely going to be overwhelming. If she has a little schedule, I would try focusing maybe at 2 or 3 activities at a time. I'll show you in a little bit a video of a student who's at this very nice, probably pretty similar transitional period, and how you kind of contain that a little bit more so it's not so overwhelming. And so that you're not risking that you're giving her all this information and she's like, I'm not sure what we're doing right now, right? Yeah, great question. I'll come back to that. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll get into that a little bit more. And I'll come back to this same point. Remind me to, I'll come to this video. We'll talk really specifically about that kind of transition. It's a good one. Okay, so this is the ridiculously non-CVI friendly tool that I made. It's super complex visually, right? And the reason why it looks like this is because I made it for the ASHA conference for speech pathologists, and they had a 3-page limit on handouts. So I had to put everything into 3 pages. So I'm working on it. It's going to get better. But this is like an in-progress tool. Oh, and also everything that I have up here, I'm happy to share with you too. This tool is still a draft, but the idea is this tool is a way of checking yourself around those balances. Is there a balance between communication level access and sensory access? So here's what it is though, with CVI adaptations, right? Color highlights. So each page, there's 3 pages. Each page is a different phase. So this is recommendations for AAC for kids in phase 2. This is page 2, right? So up on the top, phase 2. On the left side, we have material, this is the sensory part. This is the CVI part on the left side. The communication part is on the right side. So on the left side, we're looking at material considerations, right? What does the AAC system look like? And so, for one student, it might be a color adaptation, and there's some specific recommendations or considerations for kids in phase 2. Looks different from phase 3. Color, novelty, excuse me, and movement. This was for one specific student. And then environmental considerations. How can the setting itself or the environment be modified to support communication for a student in phase 2? And then the presentation of the AAC. How can the presentation be modified? We'll talk specifically about each of those. And then on the right side, you have accessible levels of communication, modes of communication that would be appropriate for either a pre-symbolic communicator, an emerging symbolic communicator, or an abstract communicator. Okay? So this is the crazy tool. Kind of break it down a little bit more from here. So this is the left side, right? Design. What does the AAC system look like? And then implementation. How are you going to use the system? Design, you have to factor in material considerations. What does it actually look and feel like? What are the materials that this communication system is made out of? Are they appropriate to what's accessible to your child visually? Environmental settings, how can the setting be modified? How can the classroom be modified? How can the home be modified in order to make this communication more accessible? And then presentation, where do you have to put communication systems in order for the child to access them visually? The very easy one with that is visual fields, right? A communication system sitting flat on a table is not accessible visually to a student who has a lower visual field deficit. That's why the student is bending over it in a really uncomfortable way that's already not good for a child who has physical motor challenges, right? So what can we do to sort of pair up that all the PT and OT related goals with visual goals and with communication goals? Okay. So this was back to stuff that we didn't cover, and I knew we weren't going to get to cover in the first session. Phase 1 intervention. Okay, so this is the sensory part. For kids who are in phase 1 of CVI, the goal is just to stabilize their visual functioning. The goal is just to look at things. It's not functional, it's just to look at things, right? Looking at things for the sake of looking at things. Looking at anything that's interesting. So in phase 1, you need a high level of environmental control, right? Dim lights, quiet room, nice seating, nobody talking, just showing things that are interesting. Kids in phase 1 are simply not processing 2D. So that already tells us one thing about what an appropriate communication system might look like. It's not two-dimensional for a kid in phase 1. Maximize visual access to communication, but don't expect visual fixation. Okay, what I mean by that is still include the child in all the activities, right? But don't expect them to be looking all the time. And if they're not looking all the time, we have to maximize other learning channels, tactile and auditory, right? So we're focusing on clear verbal communication. We're letting the child feel things in a way that isn't intrusive or abrupt or surprising. We're introducing things to the child in a way that we're not expecting them to use their vision consistently for them. And for phase 1, tactile components are critical. There has to be some kind of tactile adaptation to any communication system being used with a child in phase 1. Okay, so we have our favorite little Big Mac switches, right? They're colorful, they're simple, right? Some of these things already address color, already address characteristics. Some of them need extra adaptations, right? And again, communication level appropriate. One of the other major sort of pet peeves of mine is the use of these voice-activated switches in a way that really has no connection to the child's current level of expressive communication, right? Just hit a switch and it says a whole conversation. That's not the child expressing themselves, right? That's the child hitting a switch. So it's building some cause and effect, but it's not exactly on the expressive level of the student at that point. Visually, it's accessible at this point. Complexity, this is a finished box. It's just a little, actually, for a classroom teacher, actually for anyone, I would recommend reusing things and using things that are easy to find, that can be easily duplicated. So the easiest finish box, I think, is just ripping the top off of one of those wet wipe containers. But for this child, she really, really liked bright, shiny gold material. So we just wrapped her little finish box with gold tape, with reflective gold tape, and it really supported her visual attention. Right?
What is the bottom?
Oh yeah, the bottom right panel is like a choice board using tangible symbols. So what we're really focusing on here is think about bright colors that are actually useful, or what ways could that system be adapted even more. Also, there's reduced complexity. There's not a lot of stuff there. It depends on the level of communication. In the middle here, it's just sort of the next level of communication development for tangible symbol system, actually attaching the tangible symbols onto a device, right? So this is an 8-cell device with tactile symbols on it. Right? This is a student's little schedule board. This was pretty nice because it's pretty visually accessible. They have the tangible symbols against black cardstock, sort of separated a little bit so they don't all blend in together. And the finish box is pretty big and pretty bright, and the student can see it from 2 or 3 feet away. So the student can more independently put things into it. Right. All of these have tactile or auditory access with visual adaptations. So these are things that may be appropriate depending on your student, depending on your child, for kids who are in phase 1 or maybe early in phase 2. Right? In phase 2, the goal is to integrate vision and function. Okay? So kids in phase 2 are able to use their vision in activities, but only with adaptations. So if you don't have the right adaptations, the child really isn't using his or her vision throughout the activity. But if you just anchor the child's vision with color, movement, light, any of those characteristics, now the child's able to use their vision. So if you saw in the first session the example of the spoon that had a little red highlight on it, a little red tag at the end of it, that's a classic phase 2 adaptation, because it's taking an activity that the child's having difficulty using her vision in, and by just adapting it with color, now she's using her vision. So in phase 2, it's all about functional use of vision. There's a difference between early and late phase 2, right? It's a pretty broad difference, and you see major increase of visual curiosity and actually searching around and looking between early and late phase 2. Also, by late phase 2, there's definitely eye-to-object contact, looking directly at objects, and there's also 2D processing, two-dimensional processing by the end of phase 2. So the level of adaptation needed is going to be different. The major thing that you want to do in general for intervention, and then specifically for AAC, is you want to think about what is it that needs to be visually adapted in this activity in order for the child to use her vision. Find one or two things. A CVI schedule is a sort of a nice way to do that. It's basically what's the activity. So the activity is, let's say, bath time. And bath time is a complex, busy time. During bath time, the child is way too much physically going on and multi-sensory experience happening. So the child's not using her vision during bath time. She's looking off at the bright light or just looking away. But if you just pick a couple of things to adapt about bath time, suddenly the child is using her vision. So a bright red towel or cloth, maybe a little bit of red tape or yellow tape around the faucet. Maybe you're going to dim the lighting a little bit. Maybe you're going to always have a certain bath toy with her. It's basically a way of looking at the activity and figuring out what do I need to adapt to use vision in this activity. And you could do it across the whole day. Okay, so kind of phase 2 AAC examples. We have a 2-cell photo voice output device, and they've actually highlighted the photos as well as highlighted the words with red. This is a tactile symbol system. This is an interesting one because it's in a classroom where all of the rest of the students use Mayer-Johnson symbols, the really complicated line drawings. So the team wanted to still make her communication system sort of part of what the rest of everyone was doing. And I said to them, that's fine, but that's a totally inaccessible system. So if you want to still use that system, put it on a black cardstock and attach a symbol that is bright, tactile, and actually relates on a communication level to the activity. So toys, eating, and then toileting. And they're actual objects that are used in those activities. This is a way of supporting partner-assisted scanning for a child with CVI who really needed that extra color highlighting. So the teacher or the speech pathologist is sort of using this little yellow window, this little yellow highlight, to hover over the kind of complex symbols to teach this is what we're looking at. It's obviously for a student a little higher up on CVI level and on communication level. Okay. This is an example of starting to actually match objects to photos. So real objects to photos of those objects. Cool. So a photo of a real object next to the real object, pairing them together. Okay. So you can see how they kind of address all these different characteristics of CVI. Okay, and think about iconicity again. Think about the level of abstractness. I'm not going to spend too much time on 3D or on phase 3, but just real quickly, basically kids in phase 3 are demonstrating visual curiosity. They're looking around their environment. For kids in phase 3, they can process two-dimensional material. They just need adaptations to support their learning. They need adaptations to support what is it that I'm looking at and how to actually understand that. So the way that we talk about this is what is the salient feature? What is the unique aspect of that symbol that gives it its meaning? So for example, you have these very complex Mayer-Johnson symbols again. These are the symbols for happy and sad. On a CVI level, for a child in phase 3 even, those symbols look pretty similar to each other. So what are we going to do to highlight the salient feature, the unique aspect that makes one symbol different from another? Well, the difference is in the facial expression, right? The difference is in the actual shape of the mouth. So by taking color, again, your color highlight, yellow outline of the mouth for happy, red outline of the mouth for sad, and then also, again, separating those symbols out by yellow and red. So the same kind of concept for a complex AAC system like a Dynavox or a Proloquo, an iPad system. If you think about all of these multiple layers of categories of things that the child is choosing from, you can use color to actually highlight a conceptual idea about what we're talking about. So let's say you have an iPad system that has 6 different categories of things. You have people, foods, toys, activities, and so forth. If each one has a unique color that's associated with it, the child's going to have an easier time learning each unique category, and then they go into that category. So yellow is for food, right? Blue is for people. So it just has a yellow highlight, and when they go into that category, all of the symbols in that category also have the yellow highlight. Right? It's a way of using a CVI anchor. I want to show you a video, so I want to do that. I'll show you a really brief video, and then I'll open it to questioning. So here, sort of to follow up on your really great specific question, this is a student who has CVI in phase 2, kind of like middle phase 2, I think at this point, around 4 to 5 or 5 to 6 on the CVI range. She also has a cochlear implant, and so she does benefit from some extra tactile modifications and some sign access. But when you look at this, think about how is she using this communication system. She has emerging understanding. She knows these symbols, but she has this emerging understanding of new symbols. She probably has 4 or 5 symbols total that she's using. Think about the communication level supports, and then all the scaffolds for communication, and all the scaffolds for vision. You can probably see some of them already.
Book is all done. Hmm? Yes. Okay, Maeve. Now it's time for speech. Flip it over. Speech. Hmm? And then morning meeting. Hmm? And then
See the visually guided reach?
what's after morning meeting? Drink. And then drink. Okay. Yes, it's time for speech right now. Are you ready? Let's go.
Okay. All right. Okay. I know we have just a couple minutes, but I want to show you a couple little things here. Skip through. I can share this whole slide with you, this whole slideshow with you as well, but I wanted to just highlight. Okay, what are the CVI adaptations here? Some of them are pretty easily visible. Some of them are a little bit more subtle. Okay, so partial objects, they're not yet two-dimensional. This student was not yet quite ready for 2D, so she does still need 3D information, right? She does still need tangible symbols that are tactile in quality. But she is using her vision quite well to look at them, kind of on and off. There's a black backdrop, right, to reduce the visual clutter. Even the place in the classroom that this is happening is much less cluttered. She's not facing a busy classroom array. She's in a specific place of the classroom that blocks off the background information. With a black backdrop, there's a red rectangle to highlight what we're doing now. There's not too much information there. There's also red tape on the rim of the finish box, which supports her ability to find the finish box. And then really importantly, look at the angle that board is. It's not down flat on the table because this child really does still have a lot of difficulty with lower visual field. So it's up at a visual field that's accessible to her. Communication level access, she's using tangible symbols because that's where she is expressively. She's still learning symbols. She has some visual sign with some tactile modifications. She has some kind of constant tactile support that the teacher's right there with her. Speech and audition, and then also really importantly, how simple that routine was. Very clear communication, very clear wording, and then wait time. Time for the student to process. It was not rushed through. That same student, as she progressed in her vision, the team wasn't sure. Now she's looking at 2D. She's really interested in books. How do we convert this 3D system to a 2D system? So we actually converted it to photo cues. So we took photographs. This is a year later. We took photographs of all of the symbols that she learned tactily, and we put them on a communication board. Once she got past that conceptually, we put those same symbols on an iPad in a communication system. So now she's actually communicating with Proloquo. Now the symbols are smaller. So it really shows the progression from 3D to 2D, as well as the progression from pre-symbolic to symbolic. And now she's finally at the level of starting to develop complex use of language with these symbols. So this is maybe a year and a half after that video that you saw. Any questions? You can come and talk to me too.
Yeah.
Say again?
Do you need to have hand use, functional hand use, to be able to access the 3D communication cards or whatever they're called?
No, that's a really good question. No, I wouldn't say that they have to be accessed by hand. I've worked with lots of kids who don't have the motor skills or the fine motor skills to access symbols with their hands. But if it's tactile information that they need, you can show it visually and then show it tactily somewhere else, right? On the forearm, somewhere that is actually just providing a little bit of extra concrete tactile information. But then if the child is not using their hands functionally to access that, can they, with some supported hand-underhand reach, can they at least access it somewhere on their hand or their arm, right? Because it's not sensation that's missing, right? It's motoric skills, right? Good question. Oh yeah, sorry. You have the mic.
I have the microphone. We've played around with this a little bit, and I think something that we struggle with is traveling with it or making this form of communication accessible to her at all times. Those were big, giant things, and so I guess I struggle a little bit with how do we make that accessible to her all the time, not just in this special corner of her classroom, but to allow her to communicate whenever she wants to.
That's a great question. Yeah, portability, there's a couple different things that go into considerations for what system are you using if you're using a tangible symbol system. Portability for sure, as well as durability, like is it going to fall apart, as well as duplicatability, can you make more? But for portability, I would say once you get to the point where you really need to be bringing a lot of these things around, conceptually, she's probably already past that anyway. So if it's working on learning, 3 to maybe 8 to 10 at the most symbols, then you can just kind of like find an innovative way of moving them around. I've seen sort of like, attachments onto the side of chairs or wheelchairs or strollers to be able to have like a little Velcro section on it. Or even I've seen people use like those aprons from Home Depot or from a restaurant or something, and put some Velcro strip on there and strap one on. But if you need to be moving more than 10 of them at a time, then you probably could benefit from going to a smaller system anyway. Right? One more question right there. Oh man, you can come ask me after. Yeah. I'm here, yeah, until you're all here. Yep.
When you're using red and yellows as a border or background, how do you know that the child's not looking at that instead of the object? The same thing with like a flashlight, if you're using it for highlighting. That kind of always comes up.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say that's why in general, what you really should do on a sort of earlier visual functioning side is highlight the symbol itself rather than have a bright background. So this example of the red background, she's sort of past that. But a student who still really, really, really needs that red highlight to learn the symbol, you should just use a black background and outline the symbol itself. But at least if you're not sure if the child's looking at the thing or looking at the adaptation, at least they're looking. So it's the same concept as like reading the, Clifford the Dog books to a child who doesn't have 3D yet, and you know that they're looking at it. That's because there's a big red splotch on the book. They can't differentiate yet at this point that it's 2D Clifford, but they can see that there's that field of something, and so it's starting to direct the child's attention towards something functional, right? Over time, as vision progresses, it'll come into view and it'll be understood what is it that I'm looking at. Yeah. Thank you. Sorry to.
If everyone can do me a quick favor, this is something that we are required to do for this conference, both to get feedback for additional conferences, for our speakers, but most importantly because we've gotten some dollars from our sponsors. They are requiring us to provide them the feedback. So if you can please go to your app. All evaluations are done through the app. And on each event within the program, there's an evaluate. If you can go to the program, click on the sessions that you attended individually, and evaluate each session, that would be great. Oh, sure. It's Meet app, one word, go. If you download the app, Meet app, go. And the code is CDKL5. And you will also get you'll get an email once you've gotten an email with the app previously, but Meet app, go. MEETAP space go.
Oh my gosh. Hey, Karen.
Molly? Yeah, sorry. On the scale to 1 to 5, 5's the highest. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I forgot I had that same question when I initially looked at it too. I'm like, I assume 5 the highest. Sorry?
Do you know where I tried this all this morning?
Yeah, if it's possible for you to do that before you leave the conference, that would be great. So by the end of the weekend, that would be great. Thank you.